much. And with this, we move on to our next discussion, contextualizing new education policy. And on this panel, we are joined by Dr. Siraj Kumar, Vice Chancellor, Jindal Global University, who is a Rhodes Scholar and is the founding Vice Chancellor of Jindal Global University in India, appointed VC at the age of 34 in 2009 when the university was established. It's one of the only 20 universities in India and the only non-STEM, STEM university, which has been declared as an institution of eminence by the Government of India. We are joined by Professor N.V. Verghese, Vice Chancellor of National Institute of Educational Planning and Administration. He's also the founding director of the Center for Policy Research in Higher Education at NIPA. Professor Vimala Ramachandran, founder of ERU Consultants and former national fellow with NIPA, is among the founders who was the first national project, which was the first national project director of Mahila Samakhya, a Government of India program on women's education based in the Department of Education, Ministry of HRD. She's currently on the Research Council of Azim Premji University, Bangalore. Our industry voice, Mr. Sudhir Agarwal, Director of Business Development, Government and Education from Microsoft Corporation, India. He's an experienced CXO with over 35 years of demonstrated history of working in the information technology and services industry. Skilled in business process, project governance, sales, requirements analysis, and business nurturing. Professor Manisha Priyam, Associate Professor from NIPA, has over 2 decades of experience working with donors, policymakers, administrators, and stakeholders in policy formulation, implementation, and evaluation to do with the field of education. Research, specialization, and interests are higher education policy reforms. So we'll have the benefit of listening to her today. Primary education policy reforms, decentralization, and urban social policy reforms. Takes me back to the day, 29th of July, 2020. Prime Minister Modi tweeted, "I wholeheartedly welcome the approval of the new education policy 2020. He wrote, "This was long overdue and much awaited reform in the education sector that will transform millions of lives in the times to come. Indeed, this has been a path-breaking effort with the sole objective to enhance the quality of education equally for all and moving in the direction of strengthening India as a global superpower." Well said. Astounding 34 years since India revisited its education policy and is touted to be forward-looking, cogent reform. Sort of amalgamation of need-based policy, cutting-edge research and best practices. It is also a departure from archaic practices and pedagogy, dismantling barriers in education, integrating over 2 crore out of school children, revamped curriculum from primary to higher education, and more importantly, teacher education, training, reskilling, thus laying the foundation of a new India. So far, it sounds very good. School education, supposed to be based on experiential learning, and higher education on consolidation and innovation. Going back to the document, a careful read of 66 pages of the new education policy leaves a number of questions which this panel would like to discuss. It is forward-looking and detailed. An important area it needs to adequately address is the issue of private sector participation. At a broad level, it talks about the public good and suggests philanthropy as a means of private sector involvement, a big question mark. With the growing demand for education over the next few decades, government is expected to have difficulties in funding additional growth requirements. NEP is definitely disruptive and will have far-reaching impact on the way key players in the Indian education sector are aligned. The flip side is it covers early childhood, school education, university, higher education, vocational, so on and so forth. Very true. India's internet user base has grown exponentially. We are the world's second largest due to availability of affordable mobile phones, expansion of 3G, 4G, and now oncoming 5G coverage. India's reliance on digital transactions is growing day by day. There is a need to develop a contextualized framework. Are we putting the horse before the cart, or it's ahead of its times, or it's something which is going to give us desired results? Probably not at this point in time. So what is important? Benchmarks, digital equipment and infrastructure, not just digital content and curriculum. Need to have access to digital content. How is that going to happen? Tech savvy teachers. So we need to prepare the existing workforce into professional development and training. What's important is how do we move forward without adequate funding? So what is envisaged, therefore, for public-private partnership? It indeed is a learner-centric policy that focuses on experiential learning and vocational and transformation of higher education in India. Also puts us to achieve goal 4, which is SDG 4 of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Highlights inclusive, equitable, quality education that would promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. With the right implementation, this policy could actually mold a new India. It throws a whole lot of challenges in front of us. And with this, I would like to invite Professor Siraj Kumar to take the discussion forward.
Thank you very much, Dr. Danjal, and thank you, SKOCH Summit, and of course, this particular panel, Contextualizing New Education Policy. I'm always worried about coming after discussions on trade, and education tends to be competing with trade, and we have already lost 10 minutes, but we will try to do our best with this wonderful panel we have. The organizers have formulated the agenda very clearly. Each of us will speak first for 5 minutes, and then we will have 30 minutes for a free-flowing discussion. Some of the questions I might raise, and then we might take some questions from the chat box and other things. So it's wonderful to see all of you, Dr. Varghese, Dr. Ramachandran, Dr. Priyam, and of course, Mr. Sudhir Agarwal. We could easily call this as a NUPA panel as well, overwhelming presence of NIPA faculty. Now, let me quickly sort of a little bit outline the framework of the discussion that we hope to have. No doubt that the national education policy has created a new opportunity for reimagining and hopefully transforming the landscape of education sector. Speaking about higher education in particular, there is enormous opportunities for us to think about how we can charter the future course of education itself. If I were to quickly identify 5 major issues that we hope to address through the national education policy, all of which are issues that we will face significant dilemmas and even dichotomies. The first is the age-old discussion that we continue to have, the quality versus quantity debate. How do we address, the issue of accessibility? How do we ensure that a large number of our people get educated? And of course, how do we ensure quality as well? The second big discussion, which NEP addresses a bit, but we have to figure out how it can be implemented, is the issue of public versus private. We know that over 70% of Indian higher education institutions are today in the private sector. We also know that over 70% of Indian students are studying in private higher education institutions. In many ways, the tectonic shift that has happened in the last few decades with regard to the, both the presence and the expansion of student numbers as well as institutions in the private sector has created new challenges, and we need to address that as well. The third big dilemma is about teaching versus research. To what extent our institutions should aspire to contribute to research, to how do we build world-class universities and see the presence of leading Indian institutions in international rankings, to what extent internationalization can help us in achieving the goals of benchmarking ourselves internationally, and how do we ensure that this goal of creating a modern research oriented Humboldtian model of research university does not come in loggerheads with our commitment to ensuring teaching in many of our institutions. The fourth big aspect, which I think continues to haunt, is with regard to regulation and governance. To what extent more regulation can help us in creating greater governance, or for that matter, how do we ensure that the regulatory environment will create a better governance when it comes to education institutions? And the fifth big aspect, which I think the new education policy does address a bit, is how do we balance the values of accountability on one hand and autonomy on the other? To what extent institutions may be accountable for their own functions, and yet how do we ensure that there is autonomy and freedom within academic institutions? These five issues, I believe, are the central issues that the national education policy attempts to address, and we need to also discuss and debate about its future as well. I also want to say that one of the remarkable things about the national education policy, at least from the standpoint of its current discourse, is that there is a lot of impetus that has been generated within academic institutions to understand the policy, but also to take efforts to implement the policy as well. Of course, government itself is pushing the agenda for implementation of the national education policy, but it's important for us to understand that what are the kind of issues that we want to identify that deserves a higher degree of priority than some others, which requires a greater degree of consensus as well. With those words, I'm going to now invite Professor Varghese, Vice Chancellor of National Institute of Educational Planning and Administration, to speak for 5 minutes and give his comments. Dr. Varghese.
Thank you, Professor Rajkumar. Thank you, Professor Gursharan Singh, and also Sudarshan for inviting me to this. I am in good company, as Professor Rajkumar pointed out, with my NIPA colleagues, Professor Vimala Ramachandran and Dr. Manisha Priyam. Thank you very much. Professor Rajkumar, you have very clearly indicated 3, 4, or 5 dilemmas. Let me start with responding to 2 of the dilemmas in 1 sentence each, because I don't have time to explain this, which I can do perhaps when the question answer session comes. You mentioned about the quantity versus quality. My response to this question is that in the till the year 2000, or till the turn of this century, quantity influences quality. Quantity decided quality. That was the argument. Today, it is quality decides quantity. Because if you see the decline in enrollment in the government schools, and if you see the closure of many of the private colleges in Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, and other places, especially in the professional technical areas, it's a clear indication that it is a quality that decides, that it determines the quantity. So this has changed substantially in this century. In the last 70 years, 50 years, we saw one phenomenon, and then the remaining 20 years, we are seeing another phenomenon. The second dimension that you highlighted is the public versus private. I think India follows a pattern which is very interesting. We all want private sector institutions at the school level, and we want elite public institutions in the higher education level. So this is a very interesting phenomenon. Again, what it notifies or what it certifies is a trend towards quality. That's the point. Or in other words, what I mean to say is that the central focus of household choice today is quality. And this is also focus of the education policy. I'll come to it within a moment. Let me say that the context of education policy in 2020 is substantially different from the circumstances in which, or the context of education policy in 1968 or 1986, from these following points of view. One, we were experiencing an expanding system of education in 1968 and 86, both at the school level and at the higher education level. Today, we are experiencing a contracting system at the school level and an expanding system at the higher education level. And that is something which is very important. And secondly, the policy implicitly assumes a matured higher education system. And it assumes that India to play a global role in the world of education, in the educational landscape, we need to universalize higher education. and we had to be comparable with the developed world. I think that is one of the implicit understanding of putting a target of 50% of the gross enrollment, that is universalization of higher education by the year 2035. It is important to note that this is a target which can be easily achieved in some states and perhaps never achieved in other states. Say, for example, if you take a case of a state like Tamil Nadu, it is already 49% GER. They have already achieved before the policy is launched. And if you take a state like Kerala, it is 37%. It is only 1% addition every year, GER, to attain that. So it is very easily attainable. But if you go to states like Bihar, large states like Bihar, or small states like Goa and DU and Daman, etc., you find that it is 13%, 15%, 16%, and this target becomes very difficult to achieve. Also because of the reason that the transition rate is already very high from higher secondary education to school education, even when higher education is relatively underdeveloped and GR is very low. So the transition rate is very high, more than 80%, 60, 75%, etc. So where will you get in these states the children to be enrolled in higher education unless the secondary school system, unless the upper primary school system is universalized and expanded, So this is a major challenge for many major parts of the states that you are talking about. The policy also talks about, perhaps it's in a dilemma that, India wants to play a global role. So we want to produce global citizens and we want to produce global labor force with global skills rooted in Indian traditions and culture, So although both are important dimensions, these, unless we plan it very well, it is very difficult to achieve or balance between these two dimensions, So we have to be more open, because when we talk about internationalization policies that you're talking about in higher education, especially in the policy, when you're for the first time, when you are opening the economy or the education sector for the foreign institutions to come and open their branch campuses, it has a lot of implication for curriculum. Not only curriculum of those institutions which are coming, but also the curriculum changes that we envisage or pressurized, that will be putting pressure on the curriculum of the Indian institutions. So therefore, it becomes very difficult. And the third dimension that I would like to highlight within the next 2 minutes that I may have, I'm sure you can show me your hand, Professor Raj, when I had to stop. I'll strictly adhere to your ruling. You are a legal expert also, that's why I use the word ruling. And you'll find that the implications in terms of, the consolidation of higher education. It expects that each higher education institution should be at least having an enrollment of 3,000. It's, in my view, it's a next to impossible task. Today, there are 2,600, more than 2,600 institutions which have enrollment less than 500. And we have only 7 to 8% of the institutions which have an enrollment of 3,000, which means that what will happen to 92% or 90% of the institutions, And moreover, the public policy of establishing in higher education institutions in the rural areas was an equity-oriented dimension. It was not viability. It was neither economic viability or educational viability, but it's a concern for social equity and inclusion. Therefore, it is very important. So I feel that the consolidation, the flexible pathways to learn, and also the issues related to financing and the role of the state will be important. Sorry, I could not explain many things. I hope I'll get chance to.
Thank you very much, Professor Varghese. That was fantastic, and you really set the stage for some of the things that we will come back to. May I invite Professor Vimala Ramachandran, founder, ERU Consultants, and former National Fellow and Professor of the National Institute of Educational Planning and Administration, to share her comments.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. I have 5 minutes, so I will basically try and lay out some of the main arguments which I would like to take up. One, taking on from what the Vice Chancellor Rajkumar ji said, unlike higher education, in school education, over 75% of Indian children attend the government school sector. It's only a small percentage, 25, 30%, who are going to the private sector. And in the wake of this pandemic, of the COVID pandemic, there is a lot of evidence, which in research, which I've also been part of, to show that many, many small private schools have actually shut down. So the pressure on the government system has actually increased and will increase as the time goes by. The second point I'd like to make is that one, which is the guiding principle of the new education policy, especially when it comes to school education, is that government has to take the primary responsibility for providing good quality school education. I mean, this is made quite unequivocal in the national policy, and it doesn't talk about privatization of school education in any section of the policy. It is different when it comes to higher education, but when it comes to school education, it is not the case. One very important example, which was given in the policy and also in the documents that led up to the policy, was that after 2003, when teacher education was privatized, the number of teacher education institutions went up by some 700%, with most of them being very, very poor quality teaching shops, which Professor Krishna Kumar's committee rightly pointed out that many of them need to be actually shut down. So privatization without proper regulation of quality actually has no meaning at all. Privatization needs to go hand in hand with regulation. And regulation has to be about the quality, about teaching, about how teaching learning processes are taken forward. I would like to make one more point before I move on to what I feel are the 5 key highlights of the policy, is that affordability of school education, especially secondary education, as Professor Varghese said, is a very critical issue for the poor and especially for girls. Gujarat is such a highly developed state, but secondary education participation in Gujarat is among the lowest in the country, because in Gujarat, only 11% of secondary and high secondary schools are in the government sector, and the rest is in the private sector. So parents are not willing to spend money on the secondary education of girls. And therefore, unless you have an expansion of the government secondary education and high secondary education in a state like Gujarat, you will not have you will not be able to reach your equity goals. The second point is that when we talk about accountability, there are 2 aspects of accountability. One is punitive and one is supportive. Suppose you want to regulate the quality of the private sector, it has to be a supportive regulation which tries to help the private sector actually meet the quality standards. And just having a punitive legislation leads to a lot of corruption in the sector. So having said that, I'll just highlight what I feel are the most important for me of the national education policy. For me, the most important and the most valuable is the idea of foundational skills of literacy and numeracy, and that all children have to reach, at least achieve the foundational literacy. If children are not learning in school, then it is going to not only reflect in secondary education, it's going to reflect in higher education. Secondly, if basic foundation skills are not addressed in school education, we are not going to get teachers or people of good quality who can go through higher education and come back as teachers. The second very important thing I feel about the new education policy is that it acknowledges this as the key crisis that India is facing today. A crisis of quality, a crisis of learning. And I think the rest of the policy with respect to school education is actually geared to addressing that. And that includes 2 very, very important suggestions made by the policy. One is to restructure the school system into 3 phases, 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4, 5 years of foundational skills, that is 2 years of pre-primary, and then followed by primary, then upper primary, then secondary, the upper primary, and then secondary and higher secondary. So I think it's very important that we look at this restructuring as a very good opportunity to improve the quality in primary education and secondary education. Second, I think most important contribution of this policy has been integrating early childhood education into the whole primary and foundational cycle. Because there is so much international research that tells us that unless children are ready to learn, ready to go to school, have the conceptual ability to be able to start schooling, the schooling itself does not have much of a positive effect on them. Therefore, I think when it comes to school education, the whole privatization debate is very different from when it comes to higher education. And I do sincerely believe that when it comes to school education, the government has to be the lead and government will be the lead. I have a couple of main concerns with the education policy. In fact, one of my major concerns is that the policy is very silent on what will be the status of teachers. Because both in the higher education sector as well as in the school education sector, there is a trend towards contractual appointments, which means you have teachers who are appointed on contract for 11 months and asked to come back. And these teachers do not have any support for in-service teacher training. They do not have any support for professional development. And this is also unfortunately the case in universities, where you have universities of Delhi, for example, which is now managing with thousands and thousands of ad hoc teachers. I think we have to move out of this, and the government needs to recognize that any education system is only as good as the teachers that it has. The second and the last comment I'd like to make is that the area that I'm really very concerned about is that the government is completely silent on what policy it is going to follow with respect to privatization. In terms of, yes, there are many regulatory institutions, but the policy is very silent on how the privatization, if it is happening in higher education, is going to be regulated or supported. Thank you very much. With this, I will end.
Thank you very much, Professor Ramachandran. Some of the issues that you raised, we'll come back to it. Mr. Agarwal, I seek your indulgence, and I'm going to request Professor Manisha Priyam to speak now, and then when she finishes, you can come back and your comments will resonate with all the three other academics who spoke in the panel. So can I invite Professor Manisha Priyam, a very distinguished professor at the National Institute of Educational Planning and Administration, NIPA?
Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor Rajkumar. I am in August company, but I am in August company on very familiar grounds, because both Professor Varghese and Vimra Ramachandran are not only colleagues of the NUPA, but I think we've also been partners, and we've worked together for a long time, changing what this education policy describes as landscapes. And I would say that certain tectonic shifts happened in the policy scape, and that's a term I'm borrowing from the new education policy itself. Around 1986, when the new education policy came up, the program that Vimla described as the Mahila Samakya, I would say that's the time, and then the DPP, that's the time that we've all been associated working in some capacity or the other, mainly in the area of education reforms. Now, on this new education policy, I consider three important shifts in what is the policy landscape. The first and most important, obviously, the context, that becomes very, very important. Nowhere in the new education policy of 1986 would you hear of the differences or the tectonic shifts in context. Now, you do see that as the fundamental premise on which this new education policy, this time around, the 2020 discussions that we see are premised on. Now, that context is definitely one of globalization, and this policy opens up with an open acknowledgement of the fact that the global knowledge landscape has undergone a dramatic shift. And if India needs to make a difference, it needs to catch up, so to say, not just on the Rostow's scales of economic growth and development. If it needs to catch up, it needs to be somewhere on the global landscape of knowledge. Now, the second important shift that I see is that of national policy intent. The national policy intent is very clear in that it looks at education as a strategic national asset in a globally economic competitive world. And how does that happen? It happens when you see that India's made a transition already from when in the early 1980s, we were still caught in the low income group conundrum. We were still a part of the ASAFLA. We were still a part of the low income developing countries. We are now punching our weight and saying that treat us along with the BRICS. Those are our collaborators. We are entering what is called a middle income syndrome. In the early 90s, we were eligible for soft aid from the World Bank. As we transition towards the new economic policy of 2020, we are no longer eligible for that category. However, the debates and discussions around the 1990s, the Jompian policy, where the world sat and saw what India was doing to its children, that dramatic terrain has shifted now, and the world is watching now as to what India is going to do with its youth. Remember, we are going to be that country is going to be punching above its weight with the world's largest population of youth. And therefore, I think nations around the world, global economic competitors in the education sphere, I would say education hemisphere, so to say, are looking to the fact that whether that competition that is never mentioned in our national policy document this time around, that competition, that silent China-India competition, will India punch above its weight and maintaining a democratic and a liberal regime politically, will it be able to outmaneuver whatever deficits exist and catch up with the China phenomena, which is punching above its weight? Now, let me catch up. Let me say this in another term and say that as far as China is concerned, India and China both began borrowing from the World Bank in the 1990s. For the first time, these lendings were made, and these lendings to India and China increase the bank's own profile of lending in education as amongst the most significant lending. Until then, these were in infrastructure sectors. Now, education increased the lending portfolio. China used the loans that it took for higher education in the 1990s. India used it for school education. Now, having used those loans, India dramatically shifted its participation rates in school education. Now, those are things that Professor Varghese has made very in a very competent sort of way. He's given you the figures of the dramatic shifts that have happened, but those shifts were also one where we made a transition at the base from an elite to a mass-oriented system. Now, of those transitions, we see the knockings at the door of a whole generation of youth who are going to be first generation university or higher education or skill seekers, and they will make a knock at the door of what this new education policy talks about. Another landscape, it talks about the employment landscape. So in a sense, you've got the knockings of the global economic competition. In a sense, you've got the knockings of a whole generation of new learners who've been through the school system, good, bad, whatever it gave, coming up now to the university sector or higher education sector or the skills sector. The shift from an elite to a mass system. Now, what we find in the new education policy is that there is a commitment now to say that they will or we will together define this whole sphere of education as one that is committed to quality learning outcomes in school education and quality variously defined in higher education. Now, I would say that this is the time, therefore, to reintroduce the great debates of Indian education. Now, where I part ways with my previous co-panelists and also from some of the framing questions that Professor Rajkumar put forward was that this great debate of Indian education and Indian higher education is not really the debate between public provision and private provision, because historically, some of the finest provisions that have been made in Indian education per se have been made by what, if we look from narrow confines, could be called private. For example, would you classify Rabindranath Tagore's intervention in the great educational debates as public or private? And I will give you three observations here that Tagore, when the great debates begin around the time of the partition of Bengal, questions the marketization and utilitarian impact of the British imperial project of control. And great debates happened between Tagore and the eminent historian Jadunath Sarkar at that point of time. And Jadunath Sarkar, the eminent historian, who is still arguing for the purposes of the university in utilitarian terms. Whereas Tagore said that what India needs is a much broader canvas. It needs a multilingual university. It needs a university that is embedded in its local conditions and in a rural landscape. And therefore, Shanti Niketan was set up in rural landscapes. Now, at that point of time, that's my second and second last observation. His own nephew put out a big cartoon. and that cartoon was labeled in Bengali. And let me use the opportunity that the new education policy seeks of us to be multilingual, to use a bit of Bengali and say that that cartoon was labeled, this was Abanindranath Tagore's famous cartoon, it labeled the university as Vidyar Karkhana. And you had dhoti-clad men with their fishing rods and their sticks in their hand. They are going through a giant machine and coming out as men who are suited, booted men, but they're atomistic and individualistic. So I think that cartoon summed up that great moment. The final point that I will make is also about eminent historian Jadunath Sarkar from Kolkata, around the same time that the British imperial project of partition of Bengal was happening. And a great debate happens between historians of the Maratha School of History and Jadunath Sarkar, who was compiling a similar history from Kolkata. So at that point of time, there is an internal debate on the content and purposes of history in India. It is also the time that there is a great debate on the origins of various modern disciplines of the social sciences in India. It is the same time that you've got A.R. Vadia, you've got Radhakrishnan talking about the purposes of social philosophy, and his class lectures are published by a London publisher as the handbook on Indian philosophy. So I'll conclude by saying that when this new education policy talks about things like Gyan, Satya, and Pragya, the three tenets on which it wants to tether the wisdom of the new education policy, I will close by one invocation that yes, this is a new education policy. Where is that great Indian debate about what we want to do with the purposes of our education, whether we look at it sectorally or whether we look at it in terms of provision as public and private? The great missing is the great debate on the Indian education.
Thank you very much, Professor Priyam, for that fascinating tour de force on some of the big debates relating to education. Now, let me invite Mr. Sudhir Agarwal, Director, Business Development, Government and Education, Microsoft Corporation. Now, of course, Mr. Agarwal, you would have known why I wanted you to come at the end of all three of us, or four of us speaking, to help us really navigate about what all of this means to the future of organizations, future of work, future of jobs, future of innovation, and many things that you and your own organization, but even beyond, how it connects with the educational aspirations of India. Please, Mr. Agarwal.
Thank you, Professor Rajkumar. First thing, my sincere thanks to Scotch for me to be on such a great panel. Me being an industry person. Second, some of my observations which I will be making, they will be mostly in my personal capacity. May not be represent the Microsoft point of view. So my first point is, I think this education policy has come in a very, very different circumstances, very different scenario, when the technology has emerged as one of the key things in our life. And that too, lately, if we see, we have some of the emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, they have. So we have to see the new education policy when we look at it. How do we leverage? Because this has been the basic difference between the environment in which it has come vis-a-vis the earlier education policies. So that's the one thing. Second, I think one thing what we have been saying over years, something called education for all. Can we really take this as an opportunity to achieve that? And to me, I think my previous speakers have said, it's the two key mantras we require there. One is reach the unreached, and second is affordability. And I would think as an industry person that technology possibly has a huge role play to help us achieve that. Because recently I am experiencing that CSC, the Government of India program, CSC, they are running some of the programs, even for the nursery, using the technology. So I'm saying technology, we need to see technology interventions, how they can be used. Third part, I think I want to make very strongly, and pardon me for saying that, I think this policy now we have to see outside inside. Because ultimately education system produces, the product goes to the industry. I really don't know, and I'm trying to understand that where is the industry in evolving the new education system. And in the same voice, I'm saying industry also has to play its active and responsible role play in evolution of education policy for us. And another point, this is more like a layman person I'm saying, can we make education, more, can we teach complex subjects more simply? Or is there a continue to be a charm in teaching complex subjects in the most complex manner? And I believe we are experiencing with the evolution of technology, there is an opportunity to demystify the complex subjects in the little simpler manner and teach them accordingly. So that is where the teaching becomes more easy, more interesting, and more learning friendly. Rather than strongly teaching friendly, it become more learning friendly. Yet another observation I would like to make, and this is Dr. Gulshan, for you. You may want to pursue this, and I really don't know how academia would like to respond to this. Under this new education policy evolution, can we look at that in next 3 to 5 years, we have something like 100,000 minimum industry people becoming part of education system? Now, this could be, in terms of teaching, in terms of coaching, in terms of course content, in terms of, bringing different aspect of education, but making at least something like 100,000, industry people who have their real experience to the education system as very integral to that. And they should, such people could be formally identified by the academia system. And my last point, because I don't want to stretch it too far, my last point is, sir, with you, all of you have to really pardon me for making this statement, because I'm kind of making a small statement very humbly. I think the new education policy, how do we see it does not remain, if I'm using a strong word, in the clutches of only academia. Because why I'm saying there is a reason for that, because we need disruptive change in the education system, 360 degree. Now, we may like it or not, with due respect to the academia, all respect to the academia, they have to come out of yesteryears into tomorrow, the future. Now, this is a huge transition. So if the new education policy is typically, do not bring in the other stakeholders in the midst of it, and my strong intervention there is industry. I don't know if we really be able to take this advantage of new education policy, converting into a transformational. And my very, very last point, I think also there has to be a focus on continuous, maybe every 5 years, reorientation of faculty. Of why I'm saying, because even today I believe the research is conducted by academia, various programs are done, but more aligned to the changing world. The faculty reorientation, to me, I think is one of the strong points which should go in the midst of the new education policy evolution. I think that's where I would like to stop, because they were more like some of you might have found them statements, but I'm sharing the industry aspirations, industry perspective. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Agarwal, for that very thoughtful set of reflections, many of which are a challenge to academia, but we will come back to some of which. Now, since SKOCH Summit's theme is part of the Public Policy Forum, what I thought we'll do in the next, say, 10, 12 minutes is that I would like, all of you to reflect on the fact that there are many aspects of the national education policy which many of us will like to be implemented. And there are parts in which we may disagree as well. My question is that, besides keeping that debate, one of the major challenges that we know in our country is that the significant gap between the well-intended policies that end up getting formulated on the one hand and the institutional mechanisms, including the will and the determination on the part of the stakeholders in actually implementing the policy itself. While we can have a longer discussions on many aspects of the policy itself, I know that all of us at different points of time in our life and career have lamented about the fact that the policies have not been effectively implemented. So I'm going to quickly ask all of you a general question as to what do you think that we should do? And when I say we, it's a broader we. It could include government, regulatory bodies, it could include institutions that will actually enable the implementation of the national education policy, and that it does not remain as an aspiration that is waiting for it to be implemented even after several years. So let me begin with Professor Varghese. Can you please unmute yourself, Professor Varghese?
Side. Now it is unmuted from my side. Okay. Thank you very much. I think one of the important dimensions that needs to be taken into account is that in all policies, when you talk about policy and its implementation, some aspects of the policies are always taken up for implementation. And a major share of the policy, what policy contains, that major share is not implemented many a time. This has happened with the 1968 policy. This has happened with 86 policy. And I do not think that the situation will be different in the context of 2020 policy. Now, my point is something different. With or without the policy, there are a lot of things that can be done at the institution level. That is not happening. We need not have to wait for a policy after 3 decades or 4 decades to bring out institutional changes. Let me say a little bit more clear on this issue. Say that Indian students are respected highly abroad and they do very well. Indian professors are also respected highly well and they do very well, both abroad and in India. But Indian institutions are not respected. And Indian institutions are not respected because the institutional response to increase or enhance quality is rather poor. Even when we have NAC started in 1994, if it is only less than 33% of the universities and less than 20% of the colleges are accredited even till today, it is not because of the policy. It is not because of anything. So my feeling is that there are many lines in the policy which can be utilized, but even without the policy, if we have institutional engagement, that will make a dramatic difference in higher education.
Thank you, Professor Varghese. Professor Ramachandran?
Yeah, I'm going to just take off from where Varghese left off, is that, yes, there is a gap between policy and implementation, but I think that is happening because it is a political decision. It is a political decision as to which part of the policy and what aspects of the policy is the government going to implement. So when the 68 policy talked about common school system, we ignored it. When the 86 policy talked about importance of social equity and bridging equity gaps, we ignored many aspects of it. So this selective implementation is actually a very important political decision. On the other hand, there are many practices that we have in our education system which has no sanction in policy at all. There is no policy sanction for contractual appointment of teachers and professors. There is no policy sanction for certain kinds of privatization initiatives that happened, which actually fell through the roof, which I talked about teacher education institutions. So both happens. It is ultimately a political decision. What aspect of NEP will actually get implemented will depend a great deal on what our political leaders in Delhi and our political leaders in each of the states consider important for implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ramachandran. Professor Priyam?
I'll join the debate straight and I'll address a few points that Shri Sudhir Agarwalji made. Since it was in the nature of looking at disruptive thinking, which is precisely what I was arguing for when I was talking about the great debates, because these great debates were not happening within the government. Remember, the imperial government was coming up with its charters of education. The imperial government wanted to divide Bengal because it was a center of great academia in the sciences, in the social sciences, in the literary sphere, in the aesthetic sphere. It was emerging as a knowledge hub. Mysore was emerging as a knowledge hub. Baroda, more than anything else, was emerging as a knowledge hub, and the Imperial project was to challenge it. So then the great thinking happened right outside the sphere of the government. The great thinking happened by private provision. If I take, no two moments in history can ever be the same. But if I look at the whole thing as a natural experiment and look at what disruption can mean right now, and look at the issue of digital, let me give you a very small example. Let us not harp too much on saying we are very high on implementation right now. This policy is talking about doable things. One small iota of change that was anticipated before this policy came in was something called the Atal Tinkering Labs. And everybody thought the site of the school as a landscape is going to change. Children can come and play with science, and it's going to be seamless. Does anyone on this panel even know or understand how the Atal Tinkering Labs have worked in schools in and around you? In the work that I've done in the urban margins of Delhi while at the NUPA, Professor Varghese is one of those who supported my work on the urban. You will find that not even the greatest of the IITs or the triple ITs in the city of Delhi have bothered about what an Atal Tinkering Lab looks at the margins. Not even the great landscapes that have changed around Gurgaon because of the support of disruptive technology have bothered about what the learning landscape looks like. So to talk of learning landscapes in policy, to talk of our children as the global warriors who will compete on global testing scales, and to not look about how we provide for it at our unit, which is the margins. Professor Varghese has summed it up very well when he's talking about the transitions from the elite to the mass. Remember, these transitions are not of large percentages, changing from one station to another, saying all change now. These are of unit level institutional changes of which we have little imagination. I will conclude by saying that higher education is pilloried in India by saying, oh, here academics do not publish enough. But when I sit on my global roundtables with my fellow academics from institutions that I've studied abroad, they tell me, why in India are you worried about publishing only in peer-reviewed journals that take up to a year to review and publish, when the immediate and emergent needs of society and the learning landscape is to provide something immediately? So you hang somewhere here and there. So in a sense, I feel the Indian learning landscape would do very well to embed itself in the problems that exist on the ground and come up with very innovative solutions of what needs to be done if we are to get on to become a learning society. If the gap exists in how we create, how we write, how we sing, how we incubate, how we research, and how we think. And that's something that a policy cannot tell us, that indeed a round table does. And I'm thankful to Professor Rajkumar and the Scotch for providing us such a round table. Let this be the time that we begin with some of these great debates and think of the unit level as a model for change.
Thank you very much, Professor Priyam. Mr. Agarwal, I'm going to invite you, of course, to answer the question I asked you, but I also want to say that, in the year 1991, I entered undergrad education in an institution called Loyola College Madras, and that was 30 years ago. And we had the same issue that academia is not connected to industry. And it's quite extraordinary that 30 years later, we are raising that issue as well. So my question to you is that there are very strong and even, I would say, justified concerns that academia has when it comes to the role and responsibility of industry and business, when it comes to doing things that transcend profits. In fact, a political and moral philosopher named Michael Sandel wrote a fascinating book entitled What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets, in which Michael argued about the importance of a society in which there ought to be some things that money can't buy. And if we end up creating a society where everything money can buy, the consequence of that society is deeply institutionalized forms of inequalities and institutionalized forms of corruption. My question to you is that, Mr. Agarwal, how do we address this role and responsibility of industry when it comes to building a trusted and even a more, let's say, legitimate and credible partnership in which academic institutions are not seen as an opportunity for them to provide knowledge and expertise and technology transfers from the research that gets generated, but also industry is seen as contributing to the development of knowledge as well as innovation within academic institutions.
Great. I must thank you for asking me this, sir, because I think I have a little insight to this. One, again, I will repeat, sir, I think industry has to play its role. I think industry today, I will say, as much as academia has to walk, 2 miles, as much as maybe industry need to walk 4 miles today to come closer, because today if you see a student who's passed out, it takes minimum 6 months plus minus to become productive. Now, I think if this is the 6 month industry can invest, this can change the whole proposition. So I'm very clear that industry has to play more inclusive and active role into this. And second, as I said, now this is an opportunity to create the new education policy. How and where we are bringing industry in the midst of it, in evolution of new education policy, saying, what do you guys need? What do you want? Like, marketing today, I'll just take maybe 30 to 45 seconds. The same marketing class is taught to everyone. While today the marketing careers are very different. So can we look into micro education by bringing industry in the midst of it and say, like, towards the end, the students will be taught, differently, so that by the time they are available to the industry, they are more productive. So I think both ways, this during policy evolution stage and otherwise. So policy evolution stage, I think industry and academia and ecosystem need to bring industry seriously in the midst of it. And industry needs to play a much larger responsible role into this.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Agarwal. I noticed that Mr. Samir Kochhar is already here, and we probably have to wind up this session. So thank you to our very distinguished panelists who have been very forthcoming in this panel. I also want to appreciate Dr. Dangal and indeed the SKOCH Summit for giving us this opportunity. I thank my colleague, Professor Darshan, and the Dean of the General School of Government and Public Policy for co-hosting this panel along with SKOCH. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raj. I'll just butt in for a minute. I think I agree with Professor Vimla Ramachandran that a lot more needs to be discussed on the subject. So may I request you, if possible, if you could kindly again convene a 2-hour-long thing whenever calendars match next week or whenever, because we have this ability to make the message reach the right people, and there is so much to be said on the subject. So if you could do that, we will make sure that we host it again and it reaches the right quarters.
Wonderful.
My apologies, Dr. Vimla Ramachandran, for rushing the discussion so much. But right now this is a 1,000 people long conference, and it's almost running like television. So, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to have you, and I want to thank Professor Varghese, Professor Ramachandran, Mr. Agarwal, and Professor Priyam for their participation.
Well, thank you so much, all the professors put together. This has been some agenda driven, but yes, as submitted by Professor Ramachandran, we need to have a longish discussion on this. We'll take this further.